Kia ora koutou. It's my pleasure to be able to address you today, and thank you very much for coming out, first of all, on a sunny Sunday afternoon, and secondly, an afternoon so soon after the terrible tragedy that befell Christchurch just over a week ago. So obviously we all send our love and prayers to all those affected, and I know many of you will know those who've been affected. So it's a terrible thing. So maybe media issues don't seem to be a particularly prominent or high-profile issue in the aftermath of all of this, but there's been a conversation, I think, growing in the background about just what role social media may have played in the terrible events that we saw unfolding, a few days ago. So I'm going to address a little bit of that. I want to acknowledge David Beatson, who's an inspirational proponent of public service media. The last time I heard David speak was at the Agenda 2020 conference in Auckland. I think this was 2017. And I have to say I'd met David several times over the years, and I hadn't realised just how ill he was. Old man in a wheelchair with an oxygen bottle, and came to the front, and then in a booming voice gave one of the most inspiring visions of what public media could do. It was like a ray of sunshine. And I'm afraid I might have it rather hard to live up to that. I don't think I'm going to give too many rays of sunshine over the next 15 minutes. But I'll try. And I think what the point I want to make is that David stood for optimism in the face of adversity. And I think that's maybe a good theme for these trying times. So what I want to try and do in the next few minutes is have a think about what makes social media perhaps a bit different from traditional mass media, and ask a question about whose interests they serve. I want to discuss some themes about the impacts of social media on the traditional media, and then I want to consider, in the wake of recent events, think about some of the possibilities and limitations of regulating social media, and what we might want to do if we want the social media to serve the public interest. So I often start off, if any of my former students are here, sorry, you've probably heard this before, talking about the role of the media in relation to the state, the market and the public, and how those represent rather different expectations and pressure on them. Obviously if we look at, say, Fox News or Sky, we see the media serving commercial interests. They're businesses there to make a profit. If we look at public service principles, we might see the BBC or the ABC or Murray Television. They're there to serve the public as citizens, not just as consumers. Of course, there are media run by the state. Some people like to think that Radio New Zealand, TVNZ, is run by the state, but certainly not in the way that we would expect from an authoritarian regime. So they're rather different from the order of affairs that you might find at Russia Today, for example. But we get left with a bit of a question over social media. And just whose interests do they serve? I mean, social media sounds like it's run by the public for the public. But of course, they're big businesses as well, as Mark Zuckerberg will tell you, or won't tell us actually. So I think there's some interesting questions about just what our expectations are of social media and what rightful demands we might make of them. This is terribly wordy. I was trying to think my way through of how to explain some of the differences. And I won't belabor these points, but if we take mass media, the commercial mass media, Sky, TVNZ, of course, is a commercial outlet, MediaWorks, Stuff, APN, Herald Group and Dom Post Group. They're owned by private shareholders. They depend on subscriptions. They depend on advertising. Their mode of operandum is to provide popular content, to try and maximise sales, maximise audiences. And that appeal often carries an entertainment focus, perhaps more than an educational or informational focus. And in relation to the audience, they see us as consumers, and they also see us as a product to be sold to the advertisers. I spoke to Rick Friesen, the former head of MediaWorks TV, a few years ago. He was giving a seminar, and someone asked him a question. And they said, "Rick, what's your product?" And he said, "Well, that's a good question. That's a really good question. The product is of course, partly television. It's not necessarily what you think, though, because our main product is your eyeballs. The main thing that we deliver that makes us money is the attention of the audience. That's what we sell. The television programs are a cost. That's just something on the balance sheet. Where we make our money is your attention. So that was a very interesting insight into how the commercial media tend to look at the public. In the case of public service, like Radio New Zealand, Māori Television, BBC, SBS in Australia, of course, they tend to be owned by government or possibly public trusts. They're usually funded through government levies or taxes or licence fees, and they focus on quality, both popular and niche content, serving a diverse range of audiences. The classic phrase, to inform, to educate, and to entertain. And so they see us as citizens with a diverse range of audience needs, not just as a mass group that wants to be entertained. So how then does that map onto our expectations of social media and what I'd call digital intermediaries? Facebook, Twitter, Google, YouTube and others. They're also commercial operators. They're owned by private shareholders who want to make money. They get their money mainly from advertising, some subscription. You could subscribe to YouTube now. They also make a lot of money out of our data. That's actually the key product that gets sold, and sold to advertisers, information about the users. But their production values are interesting because they don't really produce anything. They don't actually make content at all. They use other people's content to generate an audience. And it's through the guidance of the architectures of the internet that they guide us to discover content. They enable us to find all kinds of audio-visual and informational content online. But they didn't put a penny in for this. Often it's the news media that do this, or other third-party providers. So what they're trying to do is maximise the traffic through their websites and then harvest the user's personal data so they can sell that. But they're not contributing to the pot. And so really their relationship to the audience is, well, first of all, as consumers, and then really as a niche product to be sold to advertisers, targeting us because they know exactly what we like, because we tell them. Now, this has some quite important implications. This is from Statista, March 2019, the projection of social media advertising over the next few years, up to 2023. Somewhere around, $70 billion a year. They see it going up to over $200 billion US a year, within the next 5 years or so. That's quite stunning. Roughly, global advertising spend per annum is around $500 million US, about $500 billion. It's an awful lot of money. So they're thinking probably up to 40% of that is going to be going on social media. You wonder why Zuckerberg's so rich. But what are the implications of this? Well, these are some statistics of revenues. A few years old now, but I think it's interesting. If you look at the top line, newspaper revenues over several years, if you look at the figures between 2007 and 2009, the newspapers lost over $200 million in advertising. It's partly a result of the financial crisis, but that's a huge hit. And then 2014, for the first time, online interactive advertising overtook newspaper advertising. And that's the pattern that we've seen. You can see it in the graph down here as well. This red line is interactive media. That includes social media. Huge increase. And meanwhile, television's levelling off, newspapers are going down gradually. And that's had a huge impact because the money gained by social media and online advertising hasn't just come into the market, it's been taken out of the market from the traditional media. And that's why they're having a hard time. And in fact, News Media Alliance in the US a couple of years ago suggested that Google and Facebook accounted for 70% of around the $73 billion then spent on digital advertising, and about 80% of online traffic, of referrals to online content. So that's a massive amount of market power and dominance. Like us on Facebook, we sure do. So, can social media serve as well as citizens? Well, I think, in a sense, that there's a pull dimension in media. It's interactive. We get to go and find the things that we want. So arguably, that allows us to discover things that we enjoy. Nothing wrong with that. The algorithms perhaps help us. Maybe they encourage us to find more material that we've identified as things we already like and prefer. So we get more of that. So maybe there's some efficiency. In some cases, social media could be used to circumvent repressive state controls, to promote democracy, to get round the controls of state media and hold power to account. So it could potentially enhance democracy. And maybe it could enable new grassroots communities of interest to form. Maybe it could help us build a stronger civil society. Well, maybe. But there's a downside as well. Of course, most of us use social media for entertainment functions. Again, nothing wrong with watching cat videos, but it's not really going to change the world, apart from making the people who own Grumpy Cat rather wealthy. And the algorithms that give us more of what we already want, of course, may encourage filter bubbles or echo chambers. We end up hearing more and more of the opinions that we already agree with. Maybe that enables us to insulate ourselves from hearing points of view that maybe we haven't heard before, or points of view that we might need to think about. So does that foster intolerance, perhaps even sow the seeds of extremism? Does it underline civic dialogue and our social bonds? So social media have also enabled the dissemination of fake news. Notably in the US presidential elections. And there's a potential for harm here in pandering to populist sentiment. Ignoring messages that we don't want to listen to. Again, kind of an echo chamber. But perhaps undermining the basis of a rational consensus that underpins democracy. Removing the possibility of us finding common ground with our neighbours. And then, of course, the harvesting of our personal data, quite apart from the privacy issues, has been used to orchestrate campaigns specifically to undermine democratic process, both in the Brexit campaign and the US presidential election. I haven't got time to talk about Cambridge Analytica today, but Google them. Be afraid. Be very afraid. I don't think they're all powerful, but a 1% nudge in a tight election could make quite a big difference. So, how do we make them socially responsible? Well, I think there's a growing demand for greater control over social media so that they serve the interests of the public. But I think we need to be careful what we ask for. A lot of us are angry about Facebook and the video that was disseminated through it last week, a few days back. But if we say, we want to give the state more power over Facebook, what are we actually asking for? If we give the state and intelligence services more input, then does that potentially undermine other issues? Does it lead to violations of our privacy? Does it lead to more censorship? Could that actually erode democracy? And if we say we want the corporates, the online corporates themselves to regulate things, are we giving them more power to capture more of our data, to go further and drill down into our personal lives and use that to make more money? And if we heavily regulate Facebook, Twitter, YouTube and the others, actually that won't necessarily stop the sort of things that we saw going on a few days ago. There's still extreme right-wing websites out there. There's still a dark web. That won't disappear just because we shut Facebook and YouTube down. So you can't excise the problem completely. So I've got some suggestions. My first suggestion, to make them more accountable to the mainstream media and the public interest news media in particular, is to impose a levy on our social media. Okay? The second would be to establish an independent public interest regulator, a bit like the BSA, perhaps with a code of practice for, explaining how we expect social media operators to behave and what their responsibilities actually are to the public. And maybe they could have the power to vet and maybe even rewrite in some cases or amend social media algorithms to actually have a say in how those are actually devised to make sure they serve our interests. And if social media allow the proliferation of harmful content and they fail to act swiftly and decisively in actually taking down that content and preventing its proliferation, then maybe we could impose fines. And in extreme cases, maybe the regulator should be able to go to the internet service providers and say, that's blocked, to actually stop them at the point of internet access, to actually stop these websites from being available in New Zealand. Now, maybe that's only in extreme cases, but it's actually a doable thing. Again, there's questions of censorship. I'm not saying this is a silver bullet, but it's complicated. But there are things that we could be doing, and certainly there are things we could be debating. So to sum up, I think there's no silver bullet to solve the problem of social media. I think there are things we could do, though, that would make them more accountable to the interests of the public as citizens, rather than just our prurient interests as consumers. And I think the message that we shouldn't accept from the social media or from critics is that they're too big to regulate, there's nothing that can be done. Okay? It wouldn't make any difference. I think it would. And I think if we accept that and we just assume that we're powerless to oppose the likes of Mark Zuckerberg and other social media giants, then I think we're selling ourselves short as citizens and as a public. Anyway, that's the end. Thank you. Sure.